Hi, hi everyone. Welcome to the post-lunch session of the colloquium. We go on to the next two presentations, which are clubbed together under the theme of, I think, both are looking at infrastructure. So I'll just introduce them. The two theses that will be presented now deal with questions of infrastructure. Infrastructure constructs a public, it represents it. Its mechanical and functional rhythms choreograph rituals of everyday life and public behavior as individual bodies participate in and access the public realm. The two theses discuss these notions as they examine the architecture of infrastructures in transformation, as older forms of the public are being restructured and dismantled by changes in economy. The first thesis, titled People's Media, an alternate media network through postal infrastructure by Rashmi Verma, examines the postal system as an infrastructure for communication and access to information. This, as a network system, in its spatialization, connects scales of the very local to the global. The second thesis, reviving public transportation system through the ecosystems around it, by Sumit Zadhar, examines the infrastructure of the BEST. Historically and in our imaginations, it is the image and infrastructure of mobility and access, and in that way, the very cityness of Mumbai. First, we will watch Rashmi's video, which is an examination of the postal system. Mamta?
Within this growing contamination of the mainstream media, where words and images dictate truths and stories, there lies a channel of information that is grounded, voices different perspectives, and generates a bottom up approach. Multiple organizations across the country work in tandem and are creating networks of engagement, covering stories, allowing citizen participation, spreading media literacy by means of workshops and digital material building, essentially creating alternate media networks. The project's aim is to employ architecture in taking media to the farthest places and being a catalyst for information generation. An engagement possible if one taps into the already existing network-based institutions for communication. One such all-pervasive institution is the post office. Its physical network is a structured prototype that offers the same services across administrative levels of varying scales, be it at regional, divisional, taluka, or gram panchayat level. For this project, it is a collaboration where alternate media organizations redeem their lack of physical spaces by operating through the network of existing institutions that has been losing its relevance, creating a hybrid network for these organizations to thrive on ground level and take a people-centric approach. Here, alternate media organizations can function through rented postal spaces for particular time periods. Primary program houses workspaces where organizations and individuals generate work, and the archive that has spaces for engagement and exhibit in multimedia formats. When not in use, secondary programs can be generated as per the need of the context to be multipurpose in nature. And finally, adding the mobile component, modules were designed that can be transported as a kit and then assembled on a system was to look well. This network is for organizations, citizen journalists, students, scientists, researchers, etc. The larger intervention strategy was to look at a hybrid design, comprising the static and the mobile components. The static becomes all the revamped post offices to which plugins can be made by mobile systems to ensure greater coverage and accessibility in the network. Under the mobile component, modules were designed that can be transported as a kit and then assembled on site. The project takes a complete package of programs, technologies, ways of harnessing energies to places. The module is a medium that works both ways, as a receptor of information from that area and as a portal for accessing information from across the globe. When multiplied, several more functions can be created by iterating panels as per need. Solar panels are provided to ensure self-sufficiency. Both satellite and tower connection is provided to ensure that they are always connected to the grid, no matter how remote they go. Reassembled modules can be fixed onto vehicles that are always on field, covering remote areas as media trucks, whereas the universal design allows the modules to club together and situate themselves in varying contexts while responding to climatic conditions. For the test project, I chose Thane region as it has a variety of settlements and demographic conditions from metropolitan to tribal. Also, a prototype of head post office to branch post office is present that can be replicated across the state if the pilot is successful. Each scale is situated at a different administrative level. Head post operates from postal buildings. Over 70% sub-post offices operate from rental spaces despite the availability of postal land, while branch post offices operate from the postmaster's residence. Under the static component, 3 sites were selected, one at each level. They are to act as motherships from which the mobile components spread out. I chose a metropolitan setting in Thane, a temple town in Vajreshwari, and a village called Dabhar. Through this study, I developed larger approaches that can be applied across these 3 scales. For instance, at Thane, one can work and enhance the existing. At sub-level, a postal land can be taken up where an independent structure is made with provision for alternate programs. While at branch level, a collaborative infrastructure can be created between state bodies. Each project is a demonstration of what could happen at that particular scale. In Thane, the site is an existing post office. I began by opening out the edges and making extensions with this idea of a parallel institution in mind. As it is a dense site, I tucked in the larger media functions underground to create a public space and allow for thoroughfare. The extension will lead to the removal of highlighted infill walls with bare minimal openings, hence getting in a lot more daylight and ventilation into the structure. Organization level programs occupy the extension as well as the underground spaces. Bound by public spaces for community level, the media modules now come in to create a pavilion where individual cubes can be inhabited. This parallel institution is imagined to work along with the general programs of the post office without interfering in them. Binding programs like Canteen are kept free-flowing to encourage interaction and smoothen the transition from old to new. The lower floor, an open grid, is designed in a way that individual spaces can be created as per need in the grid and opened out when there are larger events. The extension is designed to be a light, airy space that adds vibrancy to the existing structure. The community media functions are underground and the public plaza is on its terrace. The media pavilion can house cubes as per demand. Sectionally, the idea was to not add to the load of the existing, so light steel members are used in a way that they cantilever out to the old. Section through the underground space facing the extension. Multiple courtyards are provided for natural light and ventilation. This revamped post office aspires to act as a neighborhood activator by providing accessible public functions and seating spaces at the junction. The canteen and public toilets are also strategically placed to cater to pedestrians looking for spaces of pause in the city. At the second scale, postal land next to the Gram Panchayat is selected. The idea was to create a public project with the post office being one part of the larger building which could house the media functions. Worked ahead with the long bar to which modules attached on either sides. One enters the project through the post office that opens out to a canteen with media modules parked at either sides, becoming a digital archive space when put in conjunction. First floor has the workspaces and a continuation of the archive. People can occupy all parts of the project, work in cubes, learn how to write as citizen journalists, or simply rest on the plinths. The roof is upturned to allow greater quality of light in the workspaces. The plinth and the edges are designed with pedestrians in mind. Several opportunities for gathering and pause can be found. At the third scale, the office is taken out of people's homes and shifted in the Gram Panchayat premises. There are several existing buildings on site. I began by identifying the dilapidated and the functioning structures, retaining the latter. To enhance the public spaces, I created plinths that run across the project, binding all the trees together. Then situated the newer structures in response to the existing and creating two clusters. The post office is designed to respond to the intrinsic role it plays in villages as an integral public space. The idea was to create collaborative and multi-purpose spaces. For instance, the Women's Center was redesigned to be very public and open. Stairs can be taken to the upper floor for the post office. Meeting space can hold all the town meetings or larger programs. The archive can be converted into digital classrooms. The canteen can function along with the midday meal kitchen, whereas digital media space can be used as computer lab during school hours. The school children can spill out onto the courtyards, where spaces around the trees become integral to play areas, a space for all. Through this network design, the project hopes to create more informed and evolved media spaces and make the production of information more transparent and participatory in order to decentralize voices in power. Ultimately, have more control and say in our collective media environment and truly make it the people's media.
The second video presentation will play now, which is Sumit Zadhav's thesis investigating BST.
Rethinking public transportation infrastructure through understanding the characteristic of ecosystem to look at architecture as a transformative and adaptive force in the urban context. For these cities are also built with the same principles of the ecosystem where each species is dependent upon the other one. In Mumbai's ecosystem, BST is the those species who carry 5 million passengers over 443 routes. जो कि चालू हुआ था हॉरिजॉन्टल ट्रैक से बट उसके बाद इवॉल्व होता गया इतना कि बॉम्बे को पोर्ट्रेट करने के लिए बॉलीवुड में यूज होने लगा. लोग सिटी में इसलिए नहीं आते ताकि उनको घर मिल सके, वो आते इसलिए ताकि उनको जॉब मिले और वो रहते वहां पर है जहां से वो जॉब की जगह पे इजीली लोकोमोट कर सके. इसलिए जहां जहां पर ट्रांसपोर्टेशन सिस्टम बनता गया उसके अराउंड पूरा सिटी ग्रो होता गया और इसीलिए मुंबई का ट्रांसपोर्टेशन सिस्टम मुंबई का डीएनए. यही डीएनए जो कि बीएसटी है उसका बाद में डाउनफॉल होने लगा और वो फाइनेंशियल क्राइसिस फेस करने लगा और नाउ डेज दे आर फेसिंग अ लॉट बिकॉज इतनी कगार पर है कि वो अभी बीएसटी बंद हो सकता है. सो अगर बीएसटी के इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर को देखा जाए तो इनिशियली कुलाबा बस डिपो का जो डेपो है उसका डायग्राम देखा जा सकता है जिसके इनिशियल में पहले वर्कशॉप बांधा गया, बाद में इलेक्ट्रिसिटी इंट्रोड्यूस करने के लिए इलेक्ट्रिक हाउस बांधा गया, बाद में एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन बिल्डिंग बांधा गया आर्ट डेको एरा में, देन वर्कशॉप एंड ऑन अगेन. इसकी वजह से पूरा क्लस्टर क्रिएट होता गया जो कि प्रॉपर प्लानिंग नहीं था और उस स्पेस को प्रॉपरली यूज नहीं किया जा सकता. मुंबई का कुर्ला बस डिपो वो एग्जांपल है जिसमें वो लोग ने रीडेवलप किया था फाइनेंशियल क्राइसिस की वजह से, बट वो लोग ने कॉन्टेक्स्ट के बारे में कुछ सोचा ही नहीं. अगर वो सोचते तो आउटकम कुछ और होता जो कि मार्केट, स्क्रैप मार्केट और ट्रैफिक जैसे को कन्वर्ट करके बनता था. तीसरा एग्जांपल ये था अंधेरी बस डिपो का जिसमें वो लोग ने अच्छे से पूरा जैमडम जंक्शन का यूज किया था जो लैंड को प्रॉपरली यूज किया था. जिसमें आते वो लैंड के अंदर आते रेलवे स्टेशन, बस स्टॉप एंड मेट्रो स्टेशन. बट वो बिल्डिंग ऐसा बांधा गया जो कि नीचे से 2 फ्लोर ऊपर लिफ्ट किया, नीचे बस स्टॉप और ऊपर वाले फ्लोर रेंट पे देने जाने लगे जो कि एक अच्छा एग्जाम्पल था एज अ रेवेन्यू जनरेशन मॉडल. आगे देखने के अगर बस स्टॉप्स को भी देखा जाए तो वो हर कॉन्टेक्स्ट की वजह से चेंज होते रहते हैं. मार्केट के यहाँ पर वो मार्केट बन जाते हैं, स्कूल के बाहर जो बस स्टॉप है वो स्कूल का प्लेग्राउंड बन जाता है जहाँ पर माइग्रेंट से वो लोग का रहने का जगह बन जाता है. सो ये लैंग्वेज बड़ा इजीली अडेप्ट कर रहे हैं. अगर इसी छोटे छोटे सोल्यूशन को मुंबई की बीएसटी बस सॉल्व करने लगे तो वो लोग का फाइनेंशियल क्राइसिस भी सॉल्व हो सकता है. उन लोग को जरूरत है बस रिस्ट्रक्चर करने की फॉर फ्यूचर के इश्यूज जैसे कि लॉट्स ऑफ माइग्रेशन, जो घर का वैल्यू बढ़ जाएगा, रियल एस्टेट वैल्यू बहुत ज्यादा रहेगा, प्लेग्राउंड कम रहेंगे तो वो छोटे छोटे इश्यूज सॉल्व करके बीएसटी अपना रेवेन्यू जनरेशन मॉडल चेंज कर सकते हैं. शुरुआती साइट बैंड्रा बस डिपो से जिसमें नेटवर्क और उसके अराउंड का इकोलॉजी दिखाया गया. बैंड्रा बस डिपो का नेटवर्क ऐसा है कि यहाँ पर बैंड्रा बस का रेलवे स्टेशन है और यहाँ पर है बैंड्रा बस का डेपो। उसके अराउंड पूरा डेंस हाउसिंग है और बीएसटी उसको एक ब्लैंड प्लॉट की तरह बस देख रहा है। उसके बाद सम ऑफ द इमेजेस ऑफ द साइट्स, एंड मैंने उसको चालू किया अपनी तरह से ड्रॉ करने के लिए, जो कि उसमें बहुत सारे जैम जंक्शन, हाउसिंग लोड, इन इन प्रॉपर ऐसा प्लानिंग जो कि था करेक्ट करने की जरूरत। तो साइट डायग्रामिंग ऐसे है कि ये है साइट जिसमें एग्जिस्टिंग बस डिपो, एग्जिस्टिंग फ्लाईओवर कनेक्शन, दिस इज बैंड्रा एग्जिस्टिंग स्टेशन, एंड ये आने वाला है बैंड्रा का अपकमिंग मेट्रो स्टेशन। तो फ्यूचर लेयर का इमेजिन करके ये एग्जिस्टिंग प्लॉट उसमें से डिड्यूस किया हेरिटेज का जोन, और पहले पेडेस्ट्रियन पाथवे कनेक्ट किया, जंक्शन रिजोल्यूशन, vehicular movement, and then connecting flyover to the metro station through bus depot। नीचे रहेगा प्लेग्राउंड और उसके ऊपर पूरा बिल्डिंग जो कि हाउसिंग ट्रीट करेगा। सो डायग्रामिंग ऐसे है कि पहले पेडेस्ट्रियन मूवमेंट कनेक्ट करने के बाद जंक्शन रिजोल्यूशन, देन बफर स्पेस फॉर द कम्युनिटीज अराउंड, देन व्हीकुलर मूवमेंट जो कि बीएसटी बस का रहेगा, और नीचे रहेगा प्लेग्राउंड विच विल बी फॉर रेंटल एंड एज वेल एज फॉर द यूज फॉर द पीपल हु आर लिविंग अबव। इसका स्ट्रक्चर वर्क करेगा, इसलिए प्राइमरी लोड मेंबर, सेकेंडरी लोड मेंबर, देन प्राइमरी लोड मेंबर के अराउंड लिफ्ट को और उसके अराउंड स्टेयरकेस, देन कनेक्टिंग थ्रू द बीम्स, देन कनेक्टिंग प्राइमरी कॉरिडोर टू द सेकेंडरी कॉरिडोर, और पूरा नीचे वाला साइड रहेगा पूरा बस डिपो जो कि एग्जिस्टिंग है। उसके ऊपर बनेगा फूड प्लाजा जो कि कनेक्ट होगा फ्लाईओवर के थ्रू टू द मेट्रो स्टेशन। उसके ऊपर सारे रेंट, पूरा मार्केट और उसके साथ कोने में हाउसिंग, एंड देन क्लासेस, बैंक्स, एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन ऑफिस के लिए रेंटल स्पेसेस, देन द पब्लिक एरिया फॉर हाउसिंग अबव, और इसी तरह ग्रो होते हुए पूरा हाउसिंग यूनिट्स पूरा ऊपर तक जाएगा। एंड दिस इज हाउ देयर डक्ट विल बी वर्किंग। सो ये था एग्जिस्टिंग डेपो का साइट, एंड दिस विल बी प्रपोज, एंड दिस ऑल विल बी द फंक्शंस व्हिच विल बी अराउंड इट एंड ओवर इट। सो डायग्राम इज लाइक कि दी बॉटम वाला साइड रहेगा पूरा बसेस का बस स्टॉप्स एंड द प्लाजा एंड द वॉकिंग प्रोमेनाड। इसके ऊपर वाला लेयर रहेगा पूरा वेटिंग एरिया, न्यूज़पेपर स्टैंड्स, फूड प्लाजा। उसके ऊपर वाला रहेगा मार्केट्स ऑफ द ऑल टाइप ऑफ मार्केट्स, देन द रेंटल स्पेसेस फॉर द एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन ऑफिसेस, बैंक्स, क्लासरूम्स, क्लासेस, जिम्स एंड एक्सेट्रा। उसके बाद रहेगा पब्लिक रेलम जो कि रहेगा करता रहेगा ऊपर वाले हाउसिंग के लिए। सो ये था टिपिकल यूनिट जो कि देर आर 13 टाइप ऑफ टाइपोलॉजी ऑफ यूनिट विल बी रिपीटिंग फॉर ओवरऑल कंस्ट्रक्शन। सो ग्राउंड फ्लोर प्लान पे रहेगा पूरा कैंटीन एरिया, और उसके बाद वो लोग का रेस्ट रूम्स, एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन ऑफिस, बस स्टॉप्स, क्रॉसिंग्स एक्सेट्रा एक्सेट्रा, वर्कशॉप एंड द प्लेग्राउंड एट द बैक साइड। और टिपिकल फ्लोर प्लान ऐसे ऊपर बढ़ता जाएगा। सो दिस विल बी देयर। So zoomed in करने के बाद this junction resolution will be there, the staircase which is going up, and the other corner of building which is the cross moving toward the metro station, and sections and elevation. सो बिल्डिंग का फसाड ऐसे रहेगा जिसमें आगे वाले हर किसी को बैल्कनी मिलेगा, और फसाड रहेगा विथ वुड परगोला विच विल बी मूवेबल, विच विल बी क्रिएट मोर देन 40 टाइप ऑफ प्रोबेबिलिटीज। सो ये पूरा अलग अलग फसाड पूरे बिल्डिंग पे दिखेगा। डक्ट सिस्टम ऐसे वर्क करेगा, डायगोनल डक्टिंग रहेगा टॉयलेट्स के लिए, और ड्रेनेज सिस्टम बैल्कनी के थ्रू जाएगा जिगजैग, और हर किसी के बैल्कनी के एज पे प्लांटर रहेगा, एंड दिस विल बी द डिटेल ऑफ and these are some of the views.
Thank you for Ankush. I'd like to call the panelists and Sumit and Rashmi to put their videos on for a discussion. Veda?
Yeah.
Hi, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Would you like to respond to the
Me first? I'll go
projects?
first.
Yeah.
सुमित, I think मेरे लिए like तुम्हारा प्रोजेक्ट स्पेशली मुझे वो कंसेप्चुलाइजिंग जिस तरीके से तुम सोच रहे हो वो बहुत क्लियरली दिखा तुम्हारे ड्राइंग से, और वो मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगा. हाँ, इवन अभी जो प्रेजेंटेशन में जैसे दिखाया वो बिल्डअप और वो बहुत सही मतलब वो थॉट प्रोसेस और इन्वॉल्वमेंट बहुत सही तरीके से वो कम्युनिकेट होता है, तो वो मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगा. बट आई थिंक वो फाइनल डिज़ाइन में मुझे थोड़ा ये प्रॉब्लम है कि बहुत वो कैसे ब्लॉक जैसे बन गया है, you know. And the way in which you are kind of originally like, or the way like that, especially that drawing where you're thinking about, शायद वो पैनल सेकंड पैनल में या याद नहीं है, बट वो बस ऐसे, you know, the way you've sort of conceptualized your intervention, you know, it sort of, your final design goes against that, I feel, in some sense, in being so kind of blocks built up blocks, you know. So for me, the most interesting part about your project was this the communication of the idea and the involvement and sort of that conceptualizing which came was, I mean, the way you were conceptualizing it. But I think I was expecting more in the design when I was, you know, based on what I was seeing in the panels, you know. So that was my comment for you. And the post office one, I think what I really liked about yours was, again, this thing of, you know, using the one thing, but yeah, what I really liked about it was using this post office as a media network. And you know, it was, to me it seemed like quite a in a sense like a radical kind of intervention that is also grounded in what's possible, you know, like, oh, why haven't we thought of this before, sort of thing. So I really enjoyed that. But in the community, again, like I think with both these projects, my comments are more to do with how the idea gets communicated, I suppose. But what wasn't fully clear to me is how you were, what this media was, because media means so many things, you know. And you know, so I wasn't sure, one hand you're talking about news, and on the other hand you're talking about school, and other hand you're talking about like living space, and I wasn't sure what exactly was going on in the panels. So I don't know if it's my own lack of architectural expertise that sort of made it unclear, but I wasn't sure where it was, I mean, what exactly this media sort of meant. But again, in terms of this network and creating that network, connecting like these, that networked idea, I felt worked really well. And using the post office in order to create that network is something I felt worked. And also in terms of, you know, how the post office or the postal system is not used as much as it's not something that everybody relies on in the way that perhaps it once was used with digital technology. So this sort of reinvents it and makes it kind of relevant to, you know, gives it like a purpose that applies to today's times without making it seem like it's an obsolete thing that needs revival, but just sort of just reinventing it. I thought it was good. Yeah.
Professor Srivatsan, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you. See, both the projects were picked and clubbed together because both were rethinking infrastructure, you know, either a bus or a postal network, and how you reimagine. In one case, infrastructure which is less used and it occupies property. So what do you make of it as one project? The other is what appears like to be extensively used, but still has the potential to become something more. And what it can become is the question. Okay, so that's what connects both these projects, and as Veda explained in terms of drawings, etc., fairly well done. The issues to me are a couple of things. One, in the case of the bus stop, if you were to actually, sorry, my Hindi is pathetic, so I'm going to speak in English. So if you were to look at the recent attempt by the railway station boards, which have put out an extensive guideline as to how to develop railway station properties, because in a sense, the scale could be different, but in a sense, that's what's happening. There is an infrastructure which occupies a land, that interface of that infrastructure with the city in forms of station, etc., are being rethought. And there is substantial amount of property. And how do you do it? So what comes through in that, which is a problem in that rule and as well as your project, is it's essentially, it looks at how to manage the property, what it can take, how you can take it, etc. But it actually forgets this is one of the few functions which have tremendous public interface. In many ways, it's connected to things around, what happens around, how is it connected, etc. And also, just because there is a property, it has to work within its own limits. What are the limits of this plant in terms of what you can add, what you cannot add? And one doesn't have to have the entire city in one piece of plot. So, if we were to take in the idea of it being part of the larger city, looked at the interface and the immediate spaces with which it connects, which by this time have often turned into commercial area and a bit of mixed residential. So how do you deal with it? And also look at, I see it as a possibility, and that's what its potential is, your project, but it lacks a lot of specificity. So in a sense, it operates in a vacuum. One doesn't know whether you need to pack so much in this. That's because one doesn't get a sense of the place. Leave the economics aside for a moment. We can't afford to, but for an argument's sake, but I'm saying one is not getting how this approach to this bus stand emerges from that. So it looks like a typical project approach where you see what can happen, what's a variety of use, and that you can pack to that, and even form. It looks appealing, but one does have to see what works around and how does it sit, etc. All those contextual questions arise. In the case of post office, I do see that there's a big issue about the properties and function of the post office, and how do you make it relevant and also economically sort of use that space, and not only determine in its redevelopment purely from the economics, but also in terms of some social purpose, if that program can deal with. So basically, there are two components to your project, I thought. One was the idea of the social contribution of this project, and the design per se. So in that, we're talking about media, but if you were to really scale this into a larger thing, then probably things could be combined with governance, data, because how much of a media would, even though there is a, there's an outburst of media outlets, big and small, but essentially what it's doing is making it a relevant social space. Okay, so you may have to have a combination, and also you may at some point talk about its financial viability. So you may have a rich mix of social functions and this, or you could take a completely different route and say, no, this is a government property. So you have to look at it as an investment and create opportunities for society, and hence, what is that? So that larger trajectory, your position of how you want to deal with these properties and infrastructure, whether it's purely a public and social in perspective, or it's a mix of public and some commercial quasi-public thing, whether that comes from your idea of feasibility, financial feasibility of the project. So there is a little, I don't see a statement. I mean, one could keep it open, but it has to come with caveats by saying that's specific to a place and so on and so forth. And second is also, again, similar to the earlier thing, that you're designing a product and trying to use it at multiple places. The question of products as a systems comes into existence. And also, it's not just the blocks and the additions you're making, but the entire campus itself would come into play when you're doing. And don't look at that open space as something that's left over, but if you could make some connections there. So good projects, good attempts, but I think some of these limitations are there, which I'm sure you can think through further. Thank you.
Thank you. Viju, would you like to go?
Yeah, so Rashmi, I really enjoyed your project. I think the way it was narrated and the sort of the clarity through which you went about it, I really kind of enjoyed it. I mean, it's an infrastructure which is at many levels. It's a humongous infrastructure, very well networked, not in terms of its scale, but the way it is networked and connected and spread across the country. It's probably one of the few sort of infrastructure which ties us all together as a nation. You know? But what is beautiful about a post office is also how it beautifully breaks down its scale to a community. And it always been in some sense historically been the sort of, especially when you go to outside the larger cities, is really the kind of the marker for many of the smaller towns and villages, and a lot of things gets decimated from there. You often find spaces around it there. So it was historically a natural social space around which communities have come together to some extent. And I think the way you intervened continues to do that and transform it into something much more larger and reprogram it, reappropriating that, taking advantage of that infrastructure, etc., etc., is quite wonderful. I thought it was a very well done project. Of course, like Veda was bringing up, there needs to be clarity on what media is, what that programming is. I'm not getting into all that. But just the idea of kind of really reimagining that infrastructure, which is, well networked, and it kind of has the sort of a sense of human scale. You can't talk about like that in many of our other infrastructure, whether it's metros, etc. They're all humongous, but this has a very human scale to it, which I think and has a potential to go beyond the site. In the sense that it disperses things, and you continue to do that with the way you engage with in terms of mobility, transforming stuff, etc., etc. So quite a good project. Some of the comments on Veda and Watson holds true to me also, and I think those are the areas that we need to look at. Sumit, your project also, I really enjoyed your first panel in those 3 panels that you sent, and I think that kind of in many ways tempted us to shortlist you and kind of get more, understand more, and the way you kind of set the stage, for a project to come. What's disappointing me to some extent, although it's a great project, is the fact that it as in when you went more and more into the project, to me it became more and more about a real estate project, and you kind of lost about that that network, that BEST. I mean, that's to me the difference to some extent between the post office project and this, is that you've gone away from that BEST. It could have been anywhere. It could have been on a top of a railway station. So it just became about the land and the sort of the real estate and the development, etc. And I wish you kind of took a step back and see what are the potential through the sort of that network of BEST and understand that and historical perspectives, whether you can reimagine that, and that system itself, and kind of look at it. Other than that, it's a good project. Of course, there's a lot of effort in there, and get, looking at mixed use development, linking the stations, all those kind of things are extremely positive. But I wish you kind of, took a step back and looked at it, where you began the project, and see what were the potentials that you could have explored it, and not go into another direction. And that would probably strengthen that project a lot more.
Thanks, Viju. Would the students like to respond, Rashmi, Sumit?
Yeah.
Yeah. You can respond to each other's work also.
Yes. So my project essentially began with an inquiry of how the structuring of a medium determines how we engage with it. So the aspect of media that I take for this project is alternate media, which, as the name suggests, are these organizations that work parallel with all of this news and this entire network of information that we have. And this is a lot more people-centric and participatory. So the deriving the post office ka network was through media. So which is why the social aspect that was being spoken about was taken from those angles of media. And again, I had to sort of shorten 3 sites with different contexts in 8 minutes. So that's why I took the crux of every strategy and just put that. But the school and everything are existing institutions at that particular site in the village that I've taken, which is why I wanted to make collaborative institutions, and that's why my institution responded to the school. The program across the entire network remains to be workspaces and digital archives. And then there was this continuous sort of balance that I was trying to maintain in what is standardized as a product in a system and what is contextual. So the mobile modules become these standardized things that run across the network, and the design of the post office becomes something that is very responsive to that particular context, which is why those strategies were adopted. So yeah, that's about the alternate media and why it is responding to the things it is working with. Yeah.
Sunil?
Yeah. I'll also like to respond. First of all, thanks to all jurors. Nice comment. I'll have to start talking about when it's about if a structure is responding to the structure anyhow. If the necessities are getting changing to something else after a longer time, like BST is serving Mumbai from I guess around 1870s. So still the same BST is also serving today's Mumbai. And when if necessities are get shifted to something else, then it's a responsibility of that particular infrastructure to adapt those kind of necessities and work with them. As per sir, you have said there are various aspects of the BEST to look forward and work with them, like historical, social, etc. And in the urban context. Where at that moment, I have thought of um, the first crisis of the BST is a economical crisis, and let's solve it. Let's face that first, and then move ahead with them. So initial part of the thesis is like diagramming first of all, and making one formula is like is equal to MC square, whatever. Like that formula will apply anywhere in the city, and it will work for a revenue generation model. Even if it is a bus stop, a normal bus stop with the chai ka tapri and the newspaper stand where people can smoke and have a chai. Even if it is which is a place near the station where people can hang out with the food plazas and stay away, and it can hold a lot of public buffers. So at one point of movement, I thought ki I'll just make lots of bus stop, like 100 typologies, and one moment also I like think of that ki I'll just make a one building with the all kind of formula which are applied on it. So the formula which is like designed like if somewhere if necessities are different and the neighborhood is different, the formula will change, and that kind of building is the outcome of that. So I'll that's it. So in term of financial crisis and the and ecology around it, my thesis were much more much more focused. And yeah, that's it. That's it. Jude.
Would any of the panelists want to respond to this?
I'm fine.
Should we move on to the next set then?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Rashmi. Thanks, Sumit.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
I think Vikram is going to introduce the next set.
Vikram, you're on mute.
good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So it has been a long and exciting and enriching day of KRVIA Colloquium. And I'm sure all of us, especially our students, have benefited immensely from these discussions. It is commendable that all the students were able to not only present their thesis ideas conceptually, but have been able to develop a proposal which are more tangible in their implementability, as was mandated by the academic requirement. The last thesis today discusses the idea of collective memory. It explores Gandhian thoughts and values and finds it relevant even in contemporary times. I'm happy to introduce Rajvi Anandpara's thesis titled Acts of Collective Memory, a case of the local Gandhi Museum. Rajvi? Mamta, can we start the... Yeah.
Hello, I'm Rajvi Anandpara and today I present you my thesis, Acts of Collective Memory, a case of the local Gandhi Museum. The thesis intends to imagine the history that is lived and experienced in the contemporary through architecture of remembrance, which makes it possible to keep the past events alive in the common memory by physical representation in the public realm, using mnemonic devices such as historic buildings, memorials, and museums. Further taking the case of museums, it aims to re-envision a conventional museum model in the Korakendra lands of Borigli, Mumbai. The site traces its history from post-independence in 1948, which aimed to promote Mahatma Gandhi's philosophical and political ideologies. The museum in the locality is a symbol of our citizenship, but is not visited much and is unknown to many as it fails to function in a new participatory manner. The thesis attempts to understand the relevance of Mahatma Gandhi's ideologies in the present and reimagines the practices of a body, of learning, of building communities, and acts of our citizenship in a metropolitan context. I begin with an idea to state why is it important to understand our history not only as a form of knowledge, but something that is remembered or as memory. Examples like Vishwabharati University in Shantiniketan, Anacostia Museum in Washington, D.C., and the 9/11 Memorial in New York have set up rituals of remembering and association through which history can be lived, heard, and experienced. Museums are seemingly found in historic paradigms and operating structures organized by traditional rules and hierarchy. What is needed are new models of engagement, communication, and usage. California Academy of Sciences and Natural History Museum in San Francisco and the Bhaudajala Museum in Mumbai, for instance, allow to curate an active relationship between the users and the collection by engaging them as active participants on a learning journey together. Going further with these learnings, the thesis studies a conventional museum model in the Korakendra lands of Borivali, Mumbai. The complex consists of three major institutions, the local Gandhi Museum, the Khadi Bhandar, and the CB Korakendra Training Institute. The maps show how the museum traces its history from post-independence in 1948 to the present times. The view shows the Gandhi Museum building, the Khadi Bhandar, the Gandhi Ghar, and the other style structures. These are a few existing site sections and photos. It thus became imperative to study the relevance of Mahatma Gandhi's ideologies in the contemporary. This was done by developing a diagram that shows the acts of self-reflection, learning, civic life, and citizenship as chords of simple inner, mental, practical, and cohesive life, respectively. Case studies of the Gandhian institution were analyzed to understand how history can be experienced by sculpting life practices that resonate with his ideologies in the present. The Sabarmati Ashram is designed to give architectural expressions to Gandhi's words and ideologies. Hriday Kunj Kutir explores the modern relationship between body and dwelling. The architecture of Sevagrams and Niketan School offers the educators and students a space to work closely with nature as they follow the Nai Talim system of education by Gandhi, aimed towards holistic development through head, heart, and hand. Mani Bhavan today is a hallowed memorial and symbolic of a shrine. It houses several participatory programs for different age groups that reflect Gandhi's ideologies. The Gandhi Museum in Borivali was built to serve as an educational institution that would archive Mahatma Gandhi's legacies for the learnings of future generations. But it fails to engage its audience as it does not function in a new participatory manner.
the Khadi Bandar, the Gandhi Museum and the C.B. Kora Kendra Institute are therefore reimagined through a new framework to remain relevant while being true to its foundational ideology. To engage in the acts of sustainable development and self-production, the Khadi Bhandar reinterprets the idea of sustainable clothing by building cloth recycling and upcycling units. It shall also integrate with the Training Institute for Skill-Based Learnings. To engage in the acts of learning and working together, the Children's Museum, reading rooms, workshop spaces, and lecture rooms will act as bridge programs between the Gandhi Museum and the Training Institute. The objective of the C.B. Kora Kendra institution will be based on Gandhi's Nayi Talim. It will provide skill-based training to the workers and will act as an educational center for people of different age groups and professions to give them a daily space to connect with the community and nature. The recess spaces shall also contain programs for every day, such as eateries, meditation spaces, and outdoor learning spaces. The diagram highlights the different museum user groups and the spaces they shall occupy. A site neighborhood analysis was done to understand the accessibility and connectivity to the museum. The residential zones, educational institutions, and welfare associations were mapped to identify the user groups. The site plan highlights the site boundary, existing structures, and the only back road entry point to the plot. The site has a dense vegetation cover of multiple species and several tall coconut trees. The major site structures were built in different time periods beginning from 1948, thus holding a historic value and acting as mnemonic devices. To study the physical condition of these buildings, a structural analysis was conducted for the existing administrative office, Khadi warehouse, and Gandhi Museum building. Based on previous studies, site strategies were developed to sensitively build the interventions within and around the existing structures. The Gandhi Museum building, admin office, warehouses, and the Gandhi Ghar were selected to be repurposed based on their structural analysis and mnemonic value. A frontal plaza is created along the main road in order to make the site accessible and visible to the public. The edges of the plot are anchored with an insert to bring in more visitors. The interventions are designed to create contrast with the existing structures to avoid a clash. Annexes are created by inserting the new structures within the existing or simply by extending them. The spatial experience of walking through the avenue is retained. Large green spaces and pocket of open to sky areas are created as extensions to the building, allowing multiple activities and ease of movement. The multipurpose pavilion sits parallel to the main road, becoming one of the primary entry points to the museum and gallery spaces. Further leading to the production units at the back, the research wing sits parallel to the secondary road edge. The 3D view projects how sensitively the intervention sits within and around the existing structures and landscape, while creating large green spaces and pockets of building extensions to perform several collective activities. The site plan shows the trajectory of the old and the new structures within the landscape. It marks the 3 entry points to the site and the parking area. This is the ground floor plan, which I'll be now explaining in detail. The multipurpose pavilion sitting parallel to the main road edge is a lightweight steel structure that allows free movement from the public plaza to the inside. It functions as a space for outdoor workshops, exhibitions, and celebrating festivities. It further extends to connect with the Children's Museum building inside the existing RCC structure of the old warehouse. The central avenue becomes the spine, providing access to all important buildings. The Gandhi Museum is a load-bearing structure which houses permanent exhibits of Mahatma Gandhi's life. The museum extends further to connect with Children's Museum and an annex gallery on the other side. A large green area is left unbuilt for creating a beekeeping yard for honey production, a bioretention and rain garden in the flood-prone areas of the site and public park. The Gandhi Ghar at the back entrance is restored and is now open to the public. The housing block for the artists and scholars and a cafe is built within the old ruins of the site. The backside pavilion houses a research and training wing. The existing RCC structure on the right now functions as a cloth recycling unit. It further extends to become a honey unit and cloth upcycling workshop. The section cuts through the Gandhi Museum and the Children's Museum building while showing the gallery extension and elevation. A new roof system sits on top of the existing warehouse structure that now houses the Children's Museum. The two wings are connected by an extended plinth, thus creating a courtyard in the middle, allowing for spill-out activities. The Gandhi Museum building houses permanent exhibition, allowing the users to engage in the acts of collective memory. The section cuts through the museum and the gallery extension. The double-height gallery exhibits the works of contemporary artists and designers. The exploded axo shows how the new gallery sits with the Gandhi Museum building with a skylight at the junction. It also highlights all the members of both the roofing system. The section cuts through the multipurpose pavilion and the bioretention garden, which can also be used as an outdoor learning or meditation area. It shows the Gandhi Ghar and the park in elevation. The multipurpose pavilion is supported with a hollow steel column in the center and suspension cable ties anchored to the base plate. A corset batten screen is provided along the longer south-facing facade in order to control direct sunlight. The pavilion along the secondary road edge houses the research and training wing, allowing the users to engage in the acts of learning and working together. The exploded axo shows the structural system of the steel pavilion. The section cuts through the housing unit built within the old wall ruins, which look out to the outdoor cafe and performance space. The Central Avenue space can also be used for outdoor displays. The existing structure on the right is repurposed as a cloth recycling unit, and the extension now functions as a cloth upcycling workshop. The exploded axo highlights the king post truss system that sits on the existing and the new structure. The view shows the multipurpose pavilion and the public plaza. This is from the public park showing the pavilion and the children's workshop building. The view from the Central Avenue. The view from communal gardening area shows the old ruined walls and the housing block within. These are a few internal views from Children's Museum workshop, Gandhi Museum building, and Children's Museum courtyard. The Gandhi Museum thus becomes a cabinet that engages not only with the acts of preservation but also remembrance. It extends further to contain things beyond objects, but also acts of making relationship with history through the idea of memory. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Rajvi. Could we all have the cameras on and the guests can please discuss, deliberate, and comment upon Rajvi's work.
Rajvi, nice drawings and sort of this restraint that the project shows when it comes to memorializing. Not take the traditional, neither the monumental nor of some kind of exaggeration of this idea of memorializing. It's almost so that's a very important and a very strategic decision, and I'm assuming probably the idea of Gandhi sort of weighed in on what is important to me is remembering doesn't necessarily have to be of some kind of a ritualistic, sentimental sort of a thing, but also could be remembered through the kind of relevance the museum continue to play. And how do you make a museum for a person who was sort of iconoclastic in his life and the sort of restrained his life exhibits. So in that sense, I think it was a very strategic and a good way of combining the idea of knowing about the person, but also seeing it as some kind of a social asset and making the institution as a relevant institution, not only just seeing it from the point of information, but also from the point of can you hear me? That's all it is. So normally museum was rethought from purely entertainment and some bit of education, but here you're expanding that idea, which are all great. But I think in a project like this, a little more in terms of building up the arguments, particularly, the choice of yours in terms of the kind of materials that you're using to build the new facility. And when you say that it's quite sympathetic, it's not only in terms of scale and shape, but it's also sympathetic in the sort of materials, which I think you might have thought out but not articulated, because one would say, previously it was of this kind and the new one is of this kind. How does it work together? And how is it consistent with the larger idea of a Gandhian museum? So the probably there is to go to some of the Gandhian ideas and abstract it to some of its fundamentals, which is essentially how do you materials efficiently? How do you express the art of making? Because I'm sure you'd have read extensively Gandhi's involvement in design, from sandals to architecture, and his notions about how we should deal with materials and so on, and sort of interpret that creatively to explain its contemporary positioning and how it is used, how you have used to make some of the architectural decisions, is an interesting exercise, which I think you've implicitly done, but you could have brought it about, because then one may wonder, how these forms and aesthetics fit in what otherwise normally we associate Gandhi only with certain kind of organic and what normally considered as alternative materials, and how does steels and bison boards and all that fit into the, not only as an aesthetical question, but primarily as some kind of an ideological question, and in the context of remembering a person. So that part, it's a rhetorical part. It's not a design part. It's a rhetorical part, but particularly projects done in the name of evocating something, these rhetorics play a very key role, and I thought it's one could do that, because this project gives that kind of a scope, and also even asks for it in one sense. So that could have been done well. And second, I thought is also continuing with that argument of aesthetics and form making. Some of the portions were sort of a little, little surprising, to put it least, for me, and it didn't really sort of fit, and I could see that in one of the visuals. One can do what one wishes to if you take that position, but that has to be substantiated and argued. And then in the process of substantiating and arguing, you would find what you think alone is not sufficient. It needs a little buy-in. So how do you buy that buy-in into those kind of decisions? Again, an exercise in substantiation as much as in argumentation. The few points, I'll stop here, and probably my friends would add to that.
I'm still trying to formulate my comments, so if Biju can go. You're muted.
Mute, Biju.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah, I think Srivatsan has kind of outlined most of the comments. I think I really enjoyed of course, the drawings were quite very well done and very well presented. But what, like Watson was saying, that what stood out is really the restraint through which you approach the project. The only thing I would sort of add to that is that there could have been a little more thought on the materials, the details, because when you get into projects of this scale, when you sort of start to, apply that restraint, you need to get into the details as well, and I think those architectural resolutions could have been a lot more detail focused, and those drawings would have really kind of, tell some of these thoughts through those details. How do you want kind of articulates some of these philosophies, ideologies, etc., through the details that you kind of articulate. So I think that's one place where I thought the project could improve. Other than that, I don't. Because you need to kind of add these many layers to that project. Even and kind of get that clarity in its spaces. I mean, one of the great things about Gandhi Ashram, Korea's Gandhi Ashram is you have such clarity in those spaces. You go there, it kind of it allows you to be in that space without really feeling whether you are inside or outside. Of course, that's true with many of the Korea's buildings, whether it's Bharat Bhavan or it has a certain simplicity that comes through that the way that space is articulated, which I thought could have been better in your project as well in terms of how you kind of organize this relationship within the campus, and that also helps. And the scale again. I mean, I keep bringing this up. When you do a project of that. The scale of the courtyard, all of this becomes extremely important. So I think some more emphasis on those and more emphasis on the details could have made that project better. So.
Yeah, I think what I enjoyed about your project was how you sort of approach this idea of the museum and even and Gandhi and but I think I mean to some extent I felt like it was very thorough in what it tries to do and the interventions you're making, but it almost at some moments it almost feels like it's too safe. So what I would want to hear more from you about is how you sort of even position yourself. Like for me, maybe this is my bias, but this idea of memory and remembrance, I think it comes up in your video presentation in the last part. I felt like you were on one hand, the whole project kind of questions the passivity of this memory and remembrance. But then the last slide, or the last part of the video presentation again brings up this thing of the purpose of this project as being something about memory and remembrance. And I feel like you kind of go contradict yourself in that last statement that you make. So what isn't entirely clear to me is where the intervention is really, like, where it's coming from, because it's Gandhi, it's museum, it's all of these things that we know very well, and it's almost like, again, things that have become sort of, how do I say it? For lack of a better word, almost boring, the idea of a museum, the idea of memory, the idea of remembrance, and so I just feel like I'd like to hear or see more of what exactly you want to do that's kind of beyond like a safe intervention into an idea project like this. I don't know if I've made myself clear, but yeah.
Just Rajvi, once a quick point just to expand that idea of playing safe. While the restraint is absolutely needed, but the restraint is primarily from opulence, excessive. But that restraint, one doesn't have to, I just remembered as I was listening to you, this book called The Strange Details by Malcolm Gladwell, and he looks at 3-4 very important buildings, primarily from how the details sort of shift. And you remember the building absolutely because in the manner in which the material has been used and how the construction has been made visible, and that produces a certain kind of memory about that building. And of course, I'm sure you may be knowing about the buildings, but if the notion of memory, if you want to sort of do it at two levels, so that of the activity and that of architecture, and where you don't take the route of the monumental and that, but you want to play it through the idea of making in materials, which is perfectly consistent with Gandhi, then one could still make that kind of remembering the place in the manner that you possibly use materials and construction details. And I thought that's probably what, maybe exactly not what Veda meant, but to me, that's what it meant when you say you played it safe. Another small point, with a little more attention to the sequence of spaces. We have very interesting spaces, but from the road to the inside exit. could have been, you could have paid a little more attention to. Thanks.
May I answer? Thank you so much for your inputs. So, ma'am, I would like to answer your question first. So, how I began with this thesis is when I went for my internship to Madrid. There was this place which you must be aware about called Matadero. It's a cultural center in Madrid, and I would probably visit it every weekend. So, the cultural center formerly was a slaughterhouse, and right now it functions for multiple activities and for people to display their artwork, show films, etc. So, when I came back, I thought about what kind of places does our city have to offer to us, because every weekend, if I would want to plan an outing with my friends, I would probably go to a mall or a restaurant. So there are these many small parcels in the city uh, which have helped the city grow, but people aren't aware about it. So the Matadero building, which I just spoke about, is a historical artifact itself. It is now emptied of its original function, but it is standing there because of its own existence. So, the Gandhi Museum building in Borigli, I started researching about it, and the first thing I did was to interview the people who live in the neighborhood. So, to my surprise, I interviewed few of my friends and relatives who live right opposite the museum, but they had no idea that any of such place exists. So, my strategy here was to make this public space in order to create a sense of belonging. But the primary idea lies to revive the history, the identity, and also to place an individual to root them in the sense of time. So the same strategy can be applied for any other historic building which is dilapidated or a memorial. But here, the Gandhi Museum building obviously has a national identity, and I have interpreted it in a way that it is still relevant. So maybe if that answered your question. And about the materials, um, actually, I had a few more wall sections and an entire material palette as well on how I arrived. And also, I read books where Gandhi's architecture very well reflects that it totally depends on the individuals, the future of our planet. So from those quotes and those ideas is where my conscious decisions of few materials came from, which were locally sourced and available. So all of this was reflected in few of the wall sections and the material palette that I had developed, but I couldn't articulate it well for this presentation. But I think I can definitely even develop more drawings and create this sort of a process that reflects how I came upon my material choices. And about a few spaces which you mentioned that uh, were maybe safe. Actually, I had a primary focus over the fact that I didn't want to break as much as possible and also wanted to retain the existing vegetation and after studying the conditions of the building. So somehow I started developing my project around the existing buildings and the vegetations. So the open spaces, the green spaces, and other buildings that came up were a continuation of what was existing on the site. So somehow it started developing towards that. So I did not really design anything from scratch. So somewhere I might have missed out on what you were saying, but this was my design process. I hope I've answered.
Thank you, Rajini. Does any of the jurors want to say something more? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next session, the question answer session, and the closing. I hand it over to Rohan. Rohan. Anything? Sir?
Sure.
Hello.
Yeah, Rohan.
Can you hear me, or is the
We can hear
network?
you.
Yeah. All right.
Correct.
Thank you, Vikram.
Yeah.
You can hear me. All right. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for today. Thank you, Biju. Thank you, Shivatsan and Veda. It was a really interesting sort of discussion. We've been paying attention. We've all been scattered across this building. We are all in school right now, each with our own computers. There's a television there. Your entire kind of conversation was being broadcast to the lobby space, and people were walking in and out listening to these conversations. It was, I guess, the best way we could make up for the lack of the fact of having all of you here. And it would have been fantastic if you guys were here, because then I think these conversations would have been, we could have learned so much more, from things that you were saying. What I felt was, I find this to be a really kind of interesting. I find thesis itself to be a really interesting space, because it tries to mediate between, in a sense, the utopian space of the academy and the quote unquote real space of the outside. So that threshold space that's there, is always in many ways very difficult, for actually even the school to conceive of. Like, what does that really mean? At what point are we using the space to explore new grounds in architecture? And at what point are we using the space to think about, okay, like what are the real forces that are shaping architecture? The sort of dichotomy in some sense between the utopian urge and the I guess the pragmatics of the real. And I felt, when in the conversations, question of the limit was always something that came up over and over again. What are the limits that we choose to question in a project, or what are the limits that we choose to give ourselves, as I guess as a school, when we are thinking about what a thesis is? Often the very imagination of the limit tends to, we believe sometimes, tends to constrain, quote unquote, the quote unquote again creativity of the student, or the sort of theoretical possibilities that a project might be able to kind of do, new sorts of ways of imagining things, entirely perhaps commentary on the world outside, but not necessarily responding to the specifics of, let's say, economy or social structure or political systems that exist in a particular area. And I felt that that particular mediation, was an interesting one when it came to questions of scale, for example, of buildings that are really trying to address questions of the economy in the city of Bombay, where every single square inch is, highly contested. And we do recognize that, yeah, this is the situation that exists, and maybe that doesn't enable certain kinds of possibilities. And how do we then, as a school, begin to mediate the levels of reality that we introduce to the school? Or is that a sort of contradiction? Maybe I'm just kind of going around in circles. But I felt like that was an important thing, that I felt that we need to start also beginning to think about and articulate. Would any of you all like to kind of really think about how does the thesis, what kind of space the thesis is really? What do you think it should be about? Viju? Putting you on the
Yeah,
spot
no,
here.
it's thanks. So, can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear?
Hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah.
can
So,
hear you.
yeah, I see. What I really liked about many of these projects is actually the fact that it was not too utopian in that sense. It is it has it really picked up issues which are extremely relevant in today's time, and really work within that. See, there's this wonderful book called Power of the Limits by Dorchi. He says that in our fascination with invention, we often forget about the power of the limits, and the greatest creativity happens against greatest of challenges, and I think I often say that that's wonderful. That's the wonderful thing about practicing in India. I mean, I think there is no bigger lab than in India, where you will find all the. So if you want to be a creative person, this is the place to be, and you will find all kinds of challenges. And if you are ready to embrace that, you will figure out new models of development, which is what fascinating about practicing in urban India. And this is where I feel some of the projects fell short also, like for those two housing projects, for example. I think at somewhere through the project, it probably failed to understand what is the real meaning of the project is, and it became an architecture project, and thereby we kind of start to define that architecture is the making of the building, which it is not. And I think one needs to kind of look at architecture as the making of the built environment or shaping of the built environment. And building is only one component of it. And many of your answers may be a non-building, And I think when you start to kind of look at it and drive the project from that directions, then you start to find solutions to the problems that we face. Otherwise, we constantly look at buildings as our solutions, which is where we then lose direction and lose focus, and our ability to affect change for a larger good start to kind of vanish. Then it comes back to the site, it comes back to the project, but to be able to kind of constantly see what that larger picture, and I think that to me is really start to then define or change things around. I think many of the projects really, especially through the initial analysis part, really went through that, and some of these initial drawings were quite wonderful. And I think it is in that transformation into the making of the building is where I felt there is, some clarity start to get lost, And I think if you constantly try to think of what is the real meaning, why am I doing this project, and what is the purpose of that project, and stay true to that, and at every point you one kind of self-critique and constantly see that in or evaluate your project in that line, you start to then pull back things, and look at the right answers, and start to frame new questions through the projects that you do. And I think that's to me in many ways our role. Through the projects we do, we should also start to frame new questions, and which becomes evocative, and then and in that sense, every project is a hypothesis testing. It's not a building, and so some projects may fail, some projects may be successful, but one has to kind of look at it from that standpoint as a hypothesis testing, and not to try and look for the finite solution or answer for these projects. And so I think that to me was wonderful, is that many of these projects really demonstrated that ability to understand the problem.
I think there's always this kind of problem when we think about architecture as purely building. But our entire education system are also, I guess you could call it, very often the systems of validation in itself tend to favor the artifact much more, but there has been a definite, I from that in the climate, maybe rather there should be one. Shivasan, can you maybe kind of step into the conversation with your thoughts on this?
First, you see it's almost 40 years through which you've been watching many of these juries, both local, national, even international. I'm able to see substantial differences in the manner in which problems of architecture projects are framed now. And particularly in this case, what I see, in the 90s, I remember I used to have a lot of these projects. I used to look at a lot of these projects, the student projects, talks about form strategies, talk about notions of deconstruction, whatnot, and but which is very form-centric and essentially looking at architecture in a very limited sense about its own self, which it is important in a certain way. But what the current crop of work show to me is that the concerns have been broadened. Basically, people are asking relevance of what they're doing, the relevance of their design, or their domain, and how does it contribute, or how does it fit in the larger functioning of society. While in that sense it expands their boundaries, in that sense the limits that we are talking about has to be exceeded, but also not to lose sight of what one can do, what is one called to do. I mean, as a citizen, as a member of a community or different communities, I can have some ideas about how things are or should be, etc. But if I'm called to come into the room to make specific contributions about through making things, building infrastructure, building amenities, and so on, what is that I can do is what these theses is, all the 33. Barring one or two, have been all focusing about what they can do and how the projects can be meaningfully done, either by connecting with the city or addressing a social infrastructure. Or some even show, though they didn't make it to the 8, there were some projects which were more settling for small set of strategic inventions rather than go for a larger. So through these projects, they're not just questioning, but they're also through building, making. And this is a larger debate. When you actually make, when you synthesize, which is probably the key of design, it cannot be outside the limits imposed by the conditions of its production. The conditions could be economic conditions, it could be technological conditions, it could be even regulatory conditions. I mean, one can wish and say, can I move the boundary here so that I can say, but that can only be in the realm of possibility. As you know, if this was not there, what you could, or if you do this, and for it, in order to realize this, how you have to rework your boundaries. So the student project increasingly, from just looking at it as a pure possibility, is straddling this thing about between possibility and making. So you find a lot of these student projects, particularly in this bunch, going to the level of showing how you can build it also. Normally, you don't get to see that early. There'll be some meta questions, some conceptual statements. So, which means that it reflects of a certain kind of thinking going on within the institutions, or at least within the student. That it's not just enough if you only make some meta statements. You'll have to show the possibility, because that's what you're called for. And when you're called to do, and design being a synthesis way of thinking, sometimes these limitations have to be taken into account. That doesn't make that the discipline completely subservient, but its significance come in two ways, and you see that in all these projects. One, if you work within the limits, how best you push, and two, what is the way of doing things. And in order to realize that, what limits can be changed. Both have space, and I think all these projects demonstrate it. So we don't have to really worry about limits, not limits, autonomy, pragmatic. These are very important to think through the problem. But I think what these 8 projects particularly give us hope is that you can resolve all this. And you have to resolve this. You can't. You can't sort of not make. You cannot but engage. You cannot but ask for something more and something new. So I think it's an healthy. To me, I'm quite pleased with all the 33 which came in, most of them, and particularly this 8. So it gives me a lot of hope in the direction in which some of these projects are taken. Which to me, over the last 40 years, I see this substantial progress. Before also they used to think about it, but that will be large meta philosophical points, and you don't see it at a building level. But I can see that now.
I think that has also been, I think, one of the questions that we've tried to really consciously address in the school for the past few. And I think it also comes because the Bombay University itself has enabled that kind of thinking that doesn't separate acts of making and materiality away from acts of thinking. That one is thinking through materiality and the quote-unquote realities simultaneously. Veda, since you come from, like another disciplinary background, what were the sorts of parallels that you felt between what you were seeing that were the struggles that architects seem to be grappling with and your own practice?
Yeah, no, I actually think, from an artistic, as an artist, I think one sort of tends to, it's like, from what I understand of what's going on here is, for architects, it's a very sort of fine balance between what's possible, what the limitations are of reality, and even from I think from a student's point of view, I feel like to some extent that freedom needs to be taken advantage of when they're writing dissertations where, that don't necessarily have to be realized, so to sort of push what would be possible, say, when all of these guys go on to become practicing architects, so that's what I was looking for in these projects. But I think as an artist, one sort of comes at, even, for me, the first question that comes up is, we have enough buildings already, why even build? So I kind of, on one hand, come at it from that point of view, but on the other hand also there is this, I think it's much, my position sort of is a very much easier one, in that there's much less that I need to negotiate with when I execute something, so I think for me, what I'm also learning through these, or like learning through these projects, is this, what this, one hand there's a desire to make, and then there's, it's hard, I can't really articulate this very well, but I think what I still continue to question is the default role of an architect that of having to build something, and I feel like a lot of the projects sort of end up doing that. They're building because they see themselves as architects, and they have to build. So I want to see the knowledge of the understanding, that the architectural training be applied in a way where it also sort of questions this default mode of operation, where that same knowledge is applied to sort of question the way in which it's done. Ki sab jagah building banao, you do this, you do that, and sometimes it's not really necessary. So that's where, but it's again, I think each one contradicts, like on one hand you go too far on one end, and then you sort of have to pull back, take a few steps back. So it's not one or the other, but it's just a constant negotiation, so.
Thanks, Veda. Just a kind of note to the audience that if you do have any questions or comments about any of the theses, or that you'd like to have a discussion about, please do put them in the chat box. I was also quite struck by, I think this is a really important thing, this kind of act of whether one should build at all. And that is, I think, a kind of question that I think architects, especially nowadays, have begun to really take very seriously, given things like climate change and the fact that the waste of resources very often that buildings themselves can be. Unfortunately, and I don't know what Biju and Srivatsan might have to say to that, I don't think our systems of, I guess, education, validation still are able to kind of find modes through which they are able to, I guess, engage with us. And that's a struggle I think that we have to undertake as teachers of architecture within our schools, and try to kind of reframe architecture more as how Biju I think put it, as spatial practice or environmental practice, rather than the design of buildings per se. I'd like to kind of come back though to the design of buildings, just as something, and I'm also struck by, and especially I was thinking about what Srivatsan was saying about the aesthetic. I think the question of the aesthetic came up quite a bit across in many different ways across the entire thing, but especially, I guess, at the end in the Gandhi Museum, or in the mega projects that, let's say, somebody like Sumit did, which were these enormous sorts of things. The aesthetic question is one that I think we as architects, because we claim that our domain is one that is rooted in some sort of pragmatism, is one that we keep kind of fuzzy very often. We don't necessarily kind of deal with it quite straightforward. For example, in today's thesis, the aesthetic question was not necessarily one that the students were self-consciously addressing. Would that be fair to say, or do you think I'm kind of misreading the way that the theses were spoken of? Like, even when Rajvi is speaking of Gandhi, she doesn't necessarily speak of it through the aesthetic necessarily. Srivatsan?
I only remember what Skirton said. what makes who believe that architecture has an aesthetic autonomy, in the sense it's not the same aesthetics as probably other domains like art or sculpture for that matter. But nevertheless, architecture, when it meets its key criteria, which is function, always engages with the criteria of aesthetics, and even coined the term functional aesthetics. So I quite buy that argument that we may be designing, we may be pragmatic, and we may not even speak about it for various reasons, but the fact of the thing remains that we do engage in. More consciously we engage, the better it is, and I don't think one has to be. Sometimes people shy away from talking about it, but though actually engage with it. So various reasons. But for which I think just as one has deeply thought about function, form, rules, construction, one also has to deeply think about it. So it's not like, and what do you mean by that? How do you articulate it through your buildings, materials, construction, and what is the language, and how do you communicate to it? So those needs a little bit of engagement. So to think that it is drowned or it doesn't exist, I think it's not true. Only thing is people are hesitant to talk about it, or they're. But you see every project has engaged with it.
Yeah.
It's not as if they've come on their own, as if they have no control about it. They just put something here and there, and then the result. No, there's a sleight of hand that people have moved things in order to. So there is a thing. Could be brevity of time, could be many other things, but I'm sure in the making of things and using materials, and generally otherwise also engaging with other different sensory experience, even if it is space, and I think that should be thought of, and absolutely an integral, essential thing. And the debates about engaging with aesthetics and architecture have come a long way, and there's some very nuanced, sophisticated practices and arguments, and probably, hopefully, at some point, both in education and practice, we would more meaningfully talk about it.
I think that might be a less of a sort of boundary, maybe in art practices. I'm thinking about eco-aesthetics, for example, this thing that I'm kind of really interested in now, looking at how ecological consciousness is deeply affected by your kind of sensual experiences. I was actually wondering whether Veda, what do the relationship between the actually, I guess it's not a question for you in your art practice, is it?
A question of whether aesthetics is
it's fundamental to the practice, isn't it? Or
I think it's at this right now it's sort of something that's not being emphasized so much, where you have programs where I mean, if I were to really extend it, where you have like MFA programs where people from other fields without a BFA or whatever are sort of, this interdisciplinarity is encouraged, and then a skill isn't necessarily like that academic training of really improving your portraiture or, academic drawing isn't necessarily emphasized so much. So on one hand, there is a move away from aesthetics, but I think what defines an aesthetic is, I mean, what aesthetics really is something that is really being it's a discussion to have, whether it is a neat drawing or something that looks pretty, or if it's I mean, something that's pleasing, or if it's because I think aesthetic, even in architecture, it's there. Like, people have a certain sort of affinity towards the use of certain materials as opposed to others, whether it's mud construction or exposed brick or this or that. All of that is aesthetic, whether it's steel, whether it's glass, So even if on one hand we're talking about, I think basically there's a logic, and the logic is sort of driven by, I wouldn't say driven by an aesthetic, but there's a logic that produces a certain aesthetic, if that makes sense. So there invariably is an aesthetic. It's just whether it's the aesthetic that precedes precedes the outcome, or whether it's the outcome that sort of determines the aesthetic is the real question, you know. But aesthetic is, I think, central to both practices of architecture and of art.
There seems to be within architecture. Yeah, Biju, you were saying something.
No, I was just saying that in architecture, these aesthetics is also, I mean, like Srivatsan said, there is aesthetics in every project, but in architecture, it is also influenced by many other factors, in the sense that economics, for example, is one of the main drivers of aesthetics. I mean, depending on how, in the kind of materials that you choose, the kind of construction that you do. So there are many other factors which also influences that in architecture. And of course, there is a huge component which is intuitive, which is what Veda is also talking about, which kind of gets reflected in your own. I mean, whatever we do has a bit of us and our own understanding of the world. So, and I think that bit of us will come through more intuitively, while our understanding of the world gets influenced by many of these factors. And in that sense, I think the aesthetics is kind of weaved in that process, and maybe not a conscious act in architecture so much as we think of it. And which is not necessarily a bad thing. And especially, like I said, when we deal with in an urban Indian context, there are issues and things which are much more out there to be resolved and looked at, because every project is in some sense a problem solving exercise. Like, for example, when you do a housing project in a city, it's not the site and the program that you're resolving. If you're a good architect, you are also concerned about the typology, the challenges that typology faces, and then you start to place it in that context, and your aesthetics then gets driven by a lot of these other factors and influenced by them.
I'm going to there are two comments from third year students in the box. I'm just going to read them aloud, and if any one of you wants to respond to them. The first one is from Shravan Iyengar. Has the year of being online +1 fundamentally changed the overall processes involved in the thesis? Or was everything the same but formatted to a different medium? I guess he's talking to us, the teacher. Any changes we can expect to continue as things move offline, or was the traditional way always best? Anyone wants to take this question, or
you should answer that?
Okay. Shravan, it's a good question. I think one of the things that most of us teachers have felt during the online is that one of the things that at least at a more basic practical level we've missed is the making of physical models. And I think that design projects have really been affected because of the lack of those physical models. Other thing that has really been affected is just the scale in which one perceives a drawing, both for the students as well as the teachers. Usually the way in which one is able to even see a drawing is determined by a screen size. It's not necessarily determined by anything else. And I think the way that one then approaches acts of design is automatically controlled and mediated by that, and very often compromised by that. There have been incredible enablements, of course, by this entire online all of these for the end, for example, and that itself is amazing. But I would have rather had them here physically, very simply put. So I do think that as much as we were thinking on our feet and learning as we were coming along with the online semester, it's something that we'll have to continue doing. I think even now, when we go offline, I don't think we'll be able to go back completely to the traditional modes, because I think we learned a lot of things that we could work collaboratively, work with people in different places together. So I think we may have to evolve a new system that is able to hybridize the best of the online world with the world of the analog, as it were. I hope that answers your question. The next question is from Ambika Lamba. It's not really a question. She says it's just a comment. And 5 people have given a thumbs up for her. So 5 people agree with her. After 5 years of a very technical undergraduate course, thanks to a structured university curriculum, I do think that allowing thesis projects to escape the boundaries of these parameters should be perfectly all right! ! The aim to innovate and dare should be valued as much, if not more, than the beauty of the pragmatic. So she is definitely making a sort of comparison or sorts between what she calls the innovative and the pragmatic. Biju, you want to kind of answer or respond?
No, I find that the real innovator is the true pragmatic. So in the sense that In a country like ours, I always give this example. In a country like ours, we never vote for the guy who says I'll clean up my neighborhood, but we'll vote for the guy who says I'll make a bullet train. And in a country like ours, it's easy to make a bullet train than cleaning up your own neighborhood. So I think it's very important to. I mean, there's no political lineage to that. I'm just making a making a generic statement, but I think this is again going back to that comment that I said about the power of the limits. I think it's not one or the other. There is a role for innovations, but there is also a role for innovations within the limits. And I think we can't. I mean, I think it's easy to do. Again, sorry for the certain policy comments, but it's easy to do 100 smart cities than cleaning up our own cities. I think it's very important to understand. And for me, the real innovation is, cleaning up that existing cities. And I think uh, one needs to understand that that's the real innovation. And it's not the clean slate where you kind of go
Yeah.
utopian to kind of try and
Yeah.
find that things.
Yeah.
So we need to thrive to kind of embrace the challenges that are out there and try to find solution. And that's when we as a profession becomes meaningful, because for us it's today become about the aesthetic in some sense. Clients come to us for elevations, because we are not adding any value, because we are not finding solutions, finding creative solutions to the challenges that are facing us. And so I think if you want to be truly innovative, embrace what you have, and I think try to innovate within that, and you will find new models of development. I think it's quite fascinating. You look at our building regulations, you look at the way our policies are set, they are all extremely challenging. It all leads to the creation of looking at cities as real estate plots and not as a collective realm. And if I have to go there and practice and look at creating, something which is of shared value, then I have to be innovative to kind of work within these limits and try and find solutions to that. So don't shy away from that. And I think that is the real challenge, and that is the real advantage of being in a context like ours.
Shivatsa, Naveda, any of you all want to?
Just see this recurring question. We face this often. This question across different periods. It only just takes different forms, but the query is the same. You see, basically, in my view, both the discourse and practice can be divided into two camps. One camp which talks about innovation and from the point of resisting whatever the dominant thing and find out new orders and find out new things. So anything else is seen as only secondary order of solution and appreciation. So what is to be acknowledged as the best solution is the one which resists. So there's a camp of resistance which puts a lot of value and autonomy. There's another camp which is more a pragmatic camp, in which it says, yes, you may have to find possibilities, but you'll have to find within the limits. So you can't, because the architecture itself is, as a discipline, is very substantially different, both in its public nature and it's dependent on somebody else's capital and someone else's needs and so on. Just so you cannot take a complete author position. Because if you have to assist, you'll have to emphasize your position. Whereas the pragmatist is not just only pragmatist, but also seriously thinks about what the role of an architect is. So in between these two camps are somewhere in between, depending on which end of the spectrum they're leaning. Some say, innovation is to be measured only when it sort of produces something not for itself, but for the city. So, each project can be like an island, something like that. So there are different kinds of schools of thought, and there are two ways to look at this, I suppose. One is, for a sort of a self-clarity, I may understand the spectrum, but my decisions when I come to practice is very contextual. I'll hold these ideas in my mind. I have these positions, but what I do in a given situation will be determined by that situation at that moment of time. So it doesn't necessarily mean I don't have an agency there. I do have my own agency, but also I see my role within the context in which I'm operating. So I'm not giving the classical in-between answer. But the point is, we hold these the spectrum of possessions. So initially we used to think one school and as against another school, but actually each one of us have both the schools in our mind. So which only leads to what, I forget his name, who said basically most of our strategies of making is what he calls conjectural. So essentially we can even hold two contradicting viewpoints in order to produce something. Okay, so it doesn't mean that if you have pragmatic, you cannot be looking at possibility. You see, so I think it's easy to put some boxes and approaches to think, but in reality, all of us are struggling and holding contradictory, and it's most seen in architecture than any other because its very nature of its practice and discipline is like that. And you have to excuse me now. I just have to step out. So
thank you. Any comments?
I'm really sorry. I need to.
No problem. If you want to leave, it will be lovely to get comments about the general event from you one day, if you have the time.
Sure. I would. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Bye, Sri.
Veda, you want to say something, or you seemed like you wanted to say something.
No, I kind of largely agree. It's just like I don't think that being pragmatic necessarily needs to contradict, or go against having a vision. I think you can have a vision and be pragmatic at the same time. So it doesn't have to be one or the other, So pragmatism pragmatism doesn't necessarily need to be seen. It shouldn't be a bad word, is what I mean. Like I think it's something that sort of because especially like Biju says, being in a country like India, there are a lot of real pragmatics that we have to encounter, and we're all like coded beings and with coded contexts, and we begin from there, so we can't really start white. We don't have that white, that we don't have that we're not at liberty to do that. So I think that position sort of coming from that position, especially, I mean, it's like I understand where this comment comes from, but I think it's much more complex than being plain black and white. Okay, it's either pragmatic or it's possibility, freedom. So, yeah.
And you get shaped, I mean, shaped over a period of time. I think it is, I don't know what you learn in 5 years of architecture. I think you, as long as you come out with the sort of the urge to learn more, then you are constantly being influenced and shaped by the context within which you practice, context within which you kind of allow yourself to go through, and I think that's where the real discovery of yourself comes through. And I think it depends on how much you want to push and how much you want to this thing is what drives you.
I think we'll kind of running out of time. Srivatsan has also left us. So are there any sort of closing comments, Biju and Veda? And then I'll pass it on to George.
No, I'm done.
Yeah, I think we spoke enough, but really wonderful effort, and not just the 8 students, but we had a good time reviewing all the 33 presentations. Most of them are in very good shape, and in fact, we had difficulties kind of getting it shortlisted. So I think great work. We'll only urge people to kind of constantly continue to improve upon what you do and continue to take it forward. So.
Thanks, Biju. We'd love to hear your comments at length. So if you have some time to just write down something and send it to us, it'll be helpful, both of you. We'll kind of start thinking about how do we take that step forward. And we are not only interested in compliments, though we like those as well. We'd also like to know which are the areas that we should be also thinking of more. Anyway, thank you, Biju. Thank you, Veda. And
thanks, Rohan.
Moving into George.
Hi, Biju. Hi, Veda.
Hi, George.
So this is a vote of thanks. So with that, on behalf of the KRVIA, I'll take this opportunity to thank Srivatsan, though he's left now, Veda and Biju for their time and their valuable insights and thoughtful directions that they have provided to all of us. Thank you and congratulations to all our shortlisted students for patiently and meticulously putting together their presentation and participating in these discussions. I thank the graduating batch and the entire student body of the KRVIA for their participation, especially the student council for helping out put this event up. And finally, I'd like to thank the entire faculty team and the admin staff at KRVIA for their constant support since the planning of this event until today. We will continue tomorrow with the series of events at the KRVIA, beginning with the urban dialogue at 9 in the morning, followed by the convocation program at 5 tomorrow evening. And so until then, see you all. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Veda. Thank you, Briju.